My guest today was not an elected politician. She's never held a local municipal office. However, as we will see in today's podcast, she held a position in our region that helped inform some policy decisions in the region of Waterloo, particularly in Cambridge and North Dumfries. My guest today was the Executive Director of the Social Planning Council for Cambridge and North Dumfries from 2003 to 2020, when the organization was forced to discontinue its operations due to lack of continuing financial support. I met our guest around 2005 when our local community group was working on a new arena and community center in the village of Ayr. The Social Planning Council greatly assisted in helping us promote our efforts in the community. She focused her work on poverty issues, including advocacy for affordable housing, a living wage, and age-friendly communities. She was actively involved on the provincial poverty reduction strategy through her work as chair of the Social Planning Network of Ontario. She has served on the board of a number of local social agencies, including Cambridge Shelter Corporation and the Cambridge Self-Help Food Bank. I'm pleased to welcome to the Old Grey Mares podcast, my friend, Linda Terry.
Thank you, Rob. It's a real pleasure to be here today. As Rob said, we go back a long ways, back to 2005 when I first met him, and he was a volunteer before he became mayor. So, and as you know, I was very happy when you became mayor, and we had a great relationship working together on issues of the township as well as the full region.
Yeah, and we'll get into some of those. But before we jump into all of that, I just wanted to check with you. Oftentimes, this show brings on people who have, finished their public service, and I consider your work absolutely public service. It surely wasn't for money when you're in the sector, but it was for the love of the community. But what are you up to these days, Linda? Now that you're done with the Social Planning Council?
Well, I'm actually quite busy. As a good friend of mine once said, "You'll never retire; you just redirect yourself." And so I have been on several days worth of Zoom meetings every week. I particularly involved right now in the age-friendly network of Waterloo region, which was created a couple of years ago. And that's focusing on older adults primarily, looking at advocacy around two major issues. One is affordable housing, which we'll get into more about, I'm sure, in this conversation.
Yeah.
But not only affordable housing that older adults need as they age, but also how do people age in place and how do they transition but still being part of a community and not going to a long-term care facility.
Oh, okay. I love that. So aging in place, because that is it's a heart-wrenching thing when people have to leave their home, right? Their home sweet home.
Absolutely.
And I can tell you as a personal injury lawyer, I've run across, and I'm not talking about COVID-related issues, although we all know and read in the paper about what's happened in long-term care homes and COVID. But I'm talking about pre-COVID situations where the care as a son, or a sibling or a spouse of someone who's in a long-term care home, to see some of the treatment that is being received, especially when people can't care for themselves as much and have to rely on others for care. Oh, it'll just.
Yeah. So, this group has been really actively looking at what does that actually mean? And you have to start planning before you're 80 years old. And,
absolutely.
Right. So stay tuned. October 1st, we are going to put on a forum in regards, because that is Older Adult Day month in October, and we're going to have non-confirmed speaker at this point, but we're going to be discussing that issue of transitioning in place, and then have follow-up sessions around different resources in the community that an older adult can access. But we're also we want to include people who are family members of older adults, because it's a whole planning process.
I think that's the only way it can happen. You need
absolutely.
the family. If you don't have the family members, it's not going to work.
Yeah. And also for those family members to realize it's actually the older adult that needs to make those decisions and they have to be supportive. But you're
Right.
right. I mean, there's lots of things that need to happen to allow us to have more money for home care, if that's what people want, so they
Yeah.
can stay at home versus going to long-term care.
I think that is the ultimate respect. If someone who has aged, contributed to the community in whatever way, and now they're in the ultra golden years of their lives, that they can still make the choice about where
Absolutely.
they want to be. I can think of an example in Ayr here, the Vincent family, and Warren Vincent, who, has been a long time staunch Ayr supporter, active individual, and, well into his 90s now. And he's still at home in a condo, but they have a network of support workers that come in to take care of him. The family is very actively involved. All his children are actively involved. And,
Absolutely.
and I'll see him on his scooter around town, getting out and about. And it's always fun because in our town, people stop their cars, roll down the windows, shout out
Say
over to
hello.
somebody
Yeah.
walking on the sidewalk, and pretty well engaged in a conversation. So it's not only the railway that stops traffic, it's usually these conversations that
Yeah,
go on.
exactly. But no, I think this is really important. So we will be putting out information about that event. Also, the other piece around age friendly is that we are advocating around the use of public transportation for older adults, because older adults do use public transportation.
Yeah.
Certainly, definitely before COVID. And before COVID, we actually hosted several events around the region that were called Ride a Bus. And what we did is the GRT folks came in and did a whole session on how to ride a bus. And then we took people onto a bus, showed them how to load the
Right.
bus, where to
Yeah.
sit,
Right.
all the various things, how to get off, how to get on.
Yeah.
Now, unfortunately, COVID hit, so we've had to do this virtually, but we do have a couple of those events at the end of this end of August. And the other thing is to promote free ridership for older adults. There are many regions who actually have at least 1 or 2 days and sometimes more. Unfortunately, we don't. And that's the other thing
We
that we're
should, and keep advocating. I'm sure we can get regional council to accept something like that. I mean, especially I'm thinking about seniors that, once they turn 80 and they're doing those dreaded tests all the time, although they're way backed up now. But, the risk of losing your license, not to promote a car culture, but, that's how
That's
a lot
right.
of people get around. Once you've lost that, what's available to you? And so I guess they may not have had the experience of riding the bus that often, but helping them just become more
But you
accustomed
know
to that.
what? The evaluations from certainly the in-person events were fabulous.
Yeah.
And the questions that were asked, and I have to say the GRT staff who does the education have been just so wonderful to
Yeah.
work.
And LRT is a great boost for all of that as well. I mean,
Yeah,
those
absolutely.
trains are fantastic, especially I'm sure I don't know, the platforms and the trains from an age friendly perspective.
I
Do they
think
make
they're
the
really
test?
good. And certainly even buses, for a lot of older adults who did get to ride the bus, they were really surprised that the bus came down to their level.
Yes, I know.
Yeah,
It's
you don't have to walk
more
up anymore.
rider.
Yeah,
It's like you see
exactly.
those
Yeah.
those
So
cars
those are
that
that's my major work. And I'm also involved with some other, still involved with some of the committees that I was formerly on, Immigrant Partnership Council, and also some provincial work that
Yeah. So just before we talk, because I want to talk about, the show's about Social Planning Council, but let's give a little
Mhm.
shout out to your grandson for my number one fan during my regional campaign.
Yeah, well, thank you. Caius is an incredible individual. And I have to say, it is so wonderful to be able to be one-on-one with him again and close up and having conversations that we have normally had in the past. And that's been kind of difficult over COVID, including
Yeah.
celebrating his 10th birthday inside
Right.
of an open garage with an electric heater. So, he was over yesterday informing us all about research that he's been doing on various topics. So,
Oh, nice.
yeah,
Yeah, actually, you mentioned birthdays. It makes me think now we're gonna have to. The new normal is gonna have to be no cakes blown on candles, I think.
yeah, exactly, exactly. Or at a
Okay.
distance.
So let's just tell people what social, like in a sort of an elevator pitch sort of format here, what the Social Planning Council of Cambridge and North Dumfries Social Planning Council, what was that? What was that entity?
Well, it was a nonprofit organization formed in 1989. And there were some major areas that we undertook through all those years. And I would say broken up into social research, community engagement, and community development. So under social research, our key research piece every year was the Community Trends Report. So that was basically tracing trends over time. And that was going to all our local agencies and saying, okay, let's look over the last 10 years.
We'll talk about that. I just want to stick to the early days because the Trends Report came later on, I believe, but just the early days of how did this entity
how did it get to be?
Yeah, was there a need? What was it fulfilling?
Interestingly enough, probably prior to 1989, 87 or so, and this was before my time involved with the Social Planning Council, is that the city of Cambridge actually started the process. They were very interested in the fact that they needed some sort of advisory council or committee to council to look at the social issues, what was going on in our city. And so a group of volunteers got together, residents of Cambridge, and decided, well, let's do some research. Let's see what this might look like. And of course, they did the research and found that there were other cities who had a thing called the Social Planning Council. And eventually that group put together the Social Planning Council and created a board of directors. They went through all the various things that you need to do to get CRA status so that you can get donations and such.
So you say CRA, just so we know, that's the Canada Revenue Agency for anyone who's not familiar with the term.
And so all that was accomplished. So in 1989, it was actually formed.
But Linda, let me just stop for a second. What was the need though? What was the actual need here? What were they looking for?
I think the council at the time, the city council at the time, was wondering, like, what is the state of affairs of people, of their residents? Are things in good shape? Are people needing certain services that they might not have? So it was a full range of more looking at social issues, which, to be honest with you, I would say that a lot of times municipal councils don't look at social issues in the same way that maybe a regional council does, or provincial.
Right. Federal. But you know what? Let's just focus on that for a second, because I think a lot of people just assume that a township council or a city council or municipal council and staff know what their community needs from a social needs perspective. And yet, in order to know what is required, you've got to get out there and do some research.
That's right.
Exactly. And they're not really set up for that.
Well, exactly. And they really, to be honest with you, I think that's why the Social Planning Council was so successful, because they did go out there and get the research done. And in a very kind of independent minded way, not coming from a city of council perspective. So I think that was really important. And I think that many times I appeared in front of city council, and I remember distinctly one time talking about one of my favorite topics, affordable housing, and looking at the numbers of wait lists and such. And I remember this one city councilor saying to me, that's really interesting, but you know what, we're the City of Cambridge Council. We don't advocate for this. We don't have control over.
It's not what we do.
We don't sign the check for housing. Right. Yeah. So, and I said, excuse me, but you might not sign the check, but you also have representation on regional council, and you can do a thing called advocate, which means you can advocate at the provincial and the federal level for affordable housing dollars to come to your city.
Right.
And I think that was the moment things started to change a bit in regards to, oh, yeah, I guess you're right. So,
yeah, in order to be an effective advocate, I mean, you could say, hey, we need affordable housing. So, well, what's your situation? And if you can't answer what's your situation, then you don't know how to put together your ask.
That's exactly right. Exactly. Yeah.
So it was almost like, I was just curious, back in '89, do you know who was the mayor then? Was it,
It was either Miller or Jane Brewer.
yeah, I'm wondering if it was, yeah, I
Yeah, I
forget.
mean, this is way more before my time. So
Yeah, I forget who came after, who was first. I think,
Miller was first, and
okay, so,
then it was Brewer.
okay, so then Jane, so yeah, so I'm not sure when they transitioned. I think Claudette was around for the Toyota
Yes,
build.
absolutely, because she
Yeah,
drove the
so
car. She
Claudette,
drove her Corolla.
I had the pleasure of being on regional council with the two of them. I can't be thankful enough for my just brief 4 years on regional council, the people that I had an opportunity to
Oh,
meet,
absolutely.
and God bless
Absolutely.
both their souls. They were dynamic, powerful women, even in their golden years on council.
Yeah.
So it's almost like, you're almost like a census type role. I'm not saying that, but you're out there, seeing what's going on in the back roads and the streets and the alleyways of the community, which a lot of people, don't get a chance to look at, as we say, look under the hood or look under the covers or see what's going on at the grassroots. Like, we're talking the real grassroots level.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So how did you become involved then with Social Planning Council?
Well, I lived in Cambridge for a while before moving to England for a couple of years in the mid 90s. And when I came back, 97, I started thinking, okay, what do I want to do, particularly in my community? And I was also looking for a job, but I thought, no, I need to do some volunteer work locally. And so I think I went to the volunteer bureau at the time and went through all the listings of opportunities and found this thing called Social Planning Council. And I thought, oh, this sounds just up my alley. So I called the executive director at the time and I said, could I come and meet and talk to you? And I did. And I was sold. I was like, oh, I need to apply for this. So I did. And I served on the board for about 5 years, including being the president of the board, and absolutely loved my experience. Had a great board of directors, as well as a fabulous executive director, Gloria DeSantis. And again, it was, great opportunities to really move the Social Planning Council forward. So after I finished as president and came off the board, about a year later, the then current executive director after Gloria, Lamin Diallo, served with us for about a year. And then he decided he was going to go into university work at Laurier. And so I got this call from one of the senior staff that I had known through my time as board. And she said, Linda, this is what's happening. I said, oh, yeah, I hear. She goes, well, are you working right now? I said, well, actually, my 2-year contract with Community Living Ontario is finished. She goes, well, why don't you apply? And I said, what? Apply for what? She goes, the executive director. And I said, oh, no, I don't know anything about that. She goes, what do you mean you don't know anything about it? You were you were on the board for 5 years and you had done some really good work. She goes, think about it. So over the weekend, I thought about it. And I thought, okay, why not? So I applied, and that was in 2003, and I was selected as the next executive director.
Wow. So let me just ask you for a second, though, as a board member,
Mm-hmm.
what was the role? Was it like a fundraising role? Was it actually doing the research type role? What would you have been doing as the board?
Well, early on, it did do some of the work that staff would normally do because we didn't have a lot of staff.
Right.
And so even pretty much more before my time, I would say that board did more the work of the Social Planning Council. And as I came along, we started to transition out of that role, but more into a governance role. And and how to grow the organization, doing the liaison, advocating at the various levels of government. So it changed over time. We never really got into major fundraising because
Right.
The organization really didn't have it's not the same as other nonprofit agencies that can do fundraising events. So
Right.
our fundraising came through funding grants.
Okay. So, and we should just mention your background prior to coming to the Social Planning Council. What, like in terms of your education and what was your background?
I'm originally from the United States, and I went to school, my undergraduate at Boston College, a master's degree at Columbia University in New York City.
Yeah.
And I
In what
worked
area though? What area? What field of study?
education and communications.
Okay.
And I, for 3 years, spent time in the South Bronx when I lived in New York City, teaching Head Start, which was a very eye-opening experience, to say the least.
Oh, tell me about that. I just, because that's always interesting, because I did an interview with Jean Halboom, and it was really fascinating because Jean, which I didn't know about this, was educated at the University of Toronto, where she actually met, she met Jane Jacobs. She was involved in the Stop the Spadina highway or what have you, expansion, all that sort of stuff, which really formed a lot of her advocacy when she was here in Kitchener, and used a lot of the same sort of techniques or what have you. So what was Head Start? What was that about?
Well, I mean, it was a real eye opener. I mean, here I had grew up in New England, had moved to, lived in Boston, moved to New York City. And, every day would take the subway and bus for an hour and a half to get to this job. And, it's the inner city, ghettos, and the South Bronx, which was literally at times burnt out.
What year was this?
This was 78, 79, 80.
Right.
And, pretty rough conditions. And I got this job as a Head Start teacher. And Head Start is an incredible program in the United States that has been supported over the years. And it's basically to give kids a head start. And so this would be working with 3 to 5-year-olds before they enter school.
Right, right.
And, just, incredible experience working primarily with Hispanic and Black children and their families, and absolutely loved it. And
so when you became executive director of the Social Planning Council, what sort of role was it fulfilling in the community just prior to you coming on board? I'm just curious how, what direction, you may have taken it, or whenever someone new comes into a position, they're going to have a fresh set of eyes. So,
yeah, well, I mean, I think it was maybe a bit easier for me because I had been on the board, even though I said originally I knew nothing about it. So I had a good sense of the history of the Social Planning Council, where we were going, and hopefully to continue. I have to say, one of the first tasks that I had when I started was that the city of Cambridge had cut our core funding in half, from like 70,000 to 35,000. And that was my first mission. And I engaged a couple of very supportive council members at the time. And in that budget year, we did get back to 70,000.
So let me just touch on that for a second, because you raised this term core funding.
Yeah.
And I've sort of grown familiar with these terms, especially when I became mayor and started, we were interacting and with other organizations. And it's sort of like funding comes in two sort of areas approximately. There's the core funding, which is money to keep you operating at whatever it is you're doing.
Right.
And then there's, funds that are available for specific projects, which kind of, direct you into a space that may not be, it will fall within your purview, but I don't know if it's necessarily what you really want to do, but, it's funding. And so it provides you an opportunity to hire someone to carry out this project and maybe do a few other things too, because you have to be creative when you're
absolutely. But, I think you hit the nail on the head. Core funding is extremely important for the nonprofit agency. And we were fortunate that we did receive, reasonable funds from the city of Cambridge that was geared to core funding, which meant that we could use it for salaries, rent, all the basics, the admin piece of the operation. But the issue here is that if that's the only core funding you have, And as I said, we were fortunate at the time to have that core funding. A lot of agencies don't. You then rely primarily on going to funding proposals and going out and finding the funding, whether it be local or provincial, federal, and you spend a lot of time doing that. And unfortunately, that sort of funding is geared to a project. So, for example, we applied for Trillium, had many Trillium funding projects we were successful with over the years. But, it would be for 1 year, and you do all this wonderful work and have great evaluations, but then have to say, it's over. Now, sometimes Trillium had other grants that you could continue on for another year or two, but that that's kind of a very difficult thing to do.
Yeah.
Most of your time is spent looking for money.
How much time would you say, percentage-wise, you spent looking for money in your operations?
I would say that between myself and other staff members, I would say maybe a quarter to a half, depending on what time of year it was.
That's a lot of time. 25 to 50% of your time is spent looking for money. And then the other part of it is
when I first started, it wasn't that bad. But as time went on, it got.
Well, yeah. I mean, if your core funding is there and it serves what you need, you're great. But if the core funding, for example, doesn't increase, but you have to add people and then the need increases for your services, then it's hard to keep up. And then you have to find funding sources.
Absolutely. So, yeah, I mean, I think these are struggles that the nonprofit sector has always had. And to be honest with you, I think it's going to be very difficult for some of the nonprofits that exist today coming out of COVID. They've had certain benefits of some government funding or loans, but who knows? I think that in the next year, we're going to see probably some nonprofits close or maybe merge.
Right. So I just want to step back for a second because we were kind of touching on this, and I think it's an important point I just wanted to go back to because I don't think we developed or talked about it enough, was the work that you do, the research that you gather as a social agency independent of government. You're able to be sort of that trusted source of this information, that you're providing. And I think the importance of that information is it helps governments, especially municipal governments, guides them on important decisions like their planning process, like their budgets and things they should be focusing on and priorities that they develop.
Absolutely.
Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think a great example would be the research that we did, particularly around our community trends report. That was our signature piece that everybody knew about, including our governments. I mean, I know that our cities, and I think, even in North Dumfries, use that information to make budgetary decisions and kind of getting a feel of what was going on in the community. Because we collected from many, many agencies throughout Cambridge and North Dumfries, as trends over time, and it would give you a sense of like where are things at, and and our agencies were wonderful. We had a whole system set up in which how we collected the data every year. They knew we would be coming for it, and they were fabulous. And because they also used it for their program planning and also for their funding proposal.
Yeah, because not enough people realize that, and just to work it back, but if you want to look at what your community is all about, the two most important documents would be your official plan, your planning document, and the budget. Because if it's not in the official plan tells you where how your community is going to be developed. The budget tells you what is going to be spent on, what projects are going to be worked on, and that really informs you or informs a community about their community when they see what the priorities in that budget are. But in order to properly develop that, you need good base information about what your community needs. And if you can't get that, and most municipalities don't have a researcher who's just out there. They don't have the quote luxury of hiring someone to be able to just canvass the community. And frankly, if they're working for the township, I think they can be influenced somewhat. It's better to have an independent body like yours who will give it to you straight.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're independent. We were bringing the information that was coming from our agencies, right?
Yeah.
We weren't creating that data. They were creating it. We also tore apart the census every 4 years as well, with all the
Okay,
numbers.
yeah, for some
So
in-depth
that was
analysis.
really important as well,
Yes.
as well as for our agencies to have. So yeah, I think that was a definite piece of work, research that we was, as I said, a signature piece. I mean, we also did infographics on various topics. But the research was definitely a real key to.
Was the trends report or something like that always part of the social planning council work, or
Yeah,
did that,
going all the way back pretty much.
okay, and that sort of was the genesis, as you said earlier. The city of Cambridge said we need something.
Absolutely.
So you recognize, because you need to know what's going on. And I'll give you, I mean, the classic example is, you and I talk about this all the time, is the community center in North Dumfries in Ayr, right? So we started out as a grassroots group of families that just got together and said, we need something in this growing community. Our old arena's not doing it. The old community hall's not doing it. We must be able to do something better. And early on, when we formed the Center for the Community Group, part of that formation was out of some work that was going on by Social Planning Council in terms of canvassing the community to see what kind of like what the needs were. But it really galvanized around this 2-day session that the Social Planning Council put together, when you brought in a facilitator who brought people together from the community, from different groups working in the community and individuals. And it was sort of like what do you need? What is not being, how are your needs not being properly serviced in the community?
Yeah.
And they created that, was that an infographic?
Oh, the graphic design. The graphic design, yes, the facilitator was fabulous. And he took all the information and he kept drawing as you were talking.
Right. And out of that, it was really interesting, because out of that came the view that we needed a new community center. So, and that was independent, that was the number one want or ask or need that was identified through that session. And so that became part of our ammunition or support for the work we were doing in the community. And I remember Bill Davidson from Lang's, who was involved at that time, congratulating us. And I didn't really understand what it was all about, but congratulating us on the fact that that was the number one need, because I think Bill recognized that once that identified need, which was identified through a professional process, right? Like it was basically hiring a consultant to come in and it was an independent person, and identified that I think would be hard for council to ignore that. And eventually, because we didn't have a council of the willing, so to speak, on this issue. And it took a while to convince them. And eventually they did come on board and became a good partner. But Social Planning Council and Lang's with Bill Davidson were also partners, because we used to have those meetings all the time to talk about, what steps should we take? And we did that newsletter together. So
that's right.
A lot of that, and that was the community center is a transformational piece of infrastructure in our village, and really Social Planning Council played a significant role in that all coming about. And and I think I reflected that when I was mayor in terms of the support for Social Planning Council, because I always felt that information you provided was extremely valuable for us.
Yeah, I think also the role, and that was a great example out in North Dumfries. We were the ones that had the ability of calling up all the different agencies in North Dumfries and residents or whatever to say, come around the table, come and join us, and we'll facilitate the conversation. Because again, we're independent. So I think that was a great example in North Dumfries, from the community center to then putting together a newsletter.
Yeah, we used to do that, the monthly newsletter, to keep and that was important because it kept the community informed about who was all involved, and it built the profile of our group.
I remember one of the earlier days of talking about older adults, we received funding from Trillium, and we decided that we wanted to look at North Dumfries. And we did these projects of bringing older adults and youth together. And they did things like painting murals on the sidewalks. They, I believe, started the skate park. I'm trying to remember the man's name, but he was adamant that we needed a skate park for kids. And they created.
There's one now, but it's not the same one. But there was a skate park that was brought in by the Knox, not the Knox Church, the Calvary Church.
Yes.
Community. So in the parking lot, and we were able to go buy the equipment from a defunct skateboard.
Exactly. So that was just another example of how, Trillium funding at that time helped to do that project at North Dumfries. And I think it was one of the first projects that we ever funded to do any work in North Dumfries.
And that brings me to this other point. So not only do you have this research role, but you have this sort of facilitator role, which is important too, right? Because people have ideas, but they're not always sure how to go about making it a reality.
Right. Yeah. So, under our community engagement piece, I would suggest, that was bringing together agencies, individuals, government together to discuss these sorts of things. It was quite interesting because over the years, we did several different events. We did 13 poverty symposiums on various topics. We did all candidates meetings at all the levels of government, from municipal all the way to federal. But what was different than anyone else that did all candidates meeting? The one thing that we said to candidates, as we invited them, that it was going to be totally on social issues. That's where the questions were going to be.
Yeah.
And it was amazing. We didn't have much difficulty keeping to the topic. So that was really important. And we did things like tenant rights forums, which, today that would be really important to have, considering
landlord tenant issues are huge post. Well, I mean, look at what is post-pandemic. I mean, we're just going to be pandemic continual, and we're just going to have to figure things out. I mean, the landlord tenant board and driving centers and the courts are so backed up. We've got a crisis that's going on with all of that.
Well, and the number of evictions that have occurred.
Yes.
And what's happening with these folks. For a lot of the people who are faced with evictions, some are not showing up at the tribunals, not because they're not interested, but might not have the equipment to do such.
Right, exactly. No guidance.
And so they're faced by then the letter from the sheriff, and 10 days later, you're gone.
Yeah.
And there's an increase of not only lower income people, but also middle income people who are being evicted.
Absolutely. We're seeing that there's a housing crisis, which is rippling into a renter's crisis, because it's not just the lower income, it's middle income are having trouble finding places. There was just an article in the Record today about a person who sold their house and expected to find a place to rent and is having trouble. In some cases,
bidding wars
and offering a year's rent up front. Like it's atrocious.
Yeah.
But who's going to shine a spotlight on that? Now, let me ask you this. You mentioned that the funding was cut when you first came on, you had to get it back. And I think this leads to this question is, what was the biggest misunderstanding about Social Planning Council that you found amongst the politicians, for example, even the politicians?
That's an interesting question. On one hand, I would hear how valuable our work was and that it should happen. But then when it came to the crunch, there wasn't the money for it. And to this day, I still think about those conversations with some of the politicians at the city and also the region. And I still question, what didn't you get? Because on one hand, you're saying it's valuable and we need it. But when the crunch came to saying, okay, here's your funding, or even continuing funding, but we were talking about increasing the funding as well, because things get more expensive and you have to hire more staff or whatever. So I still think about those conversations, and I don't think I ever really got an answer.
Right. I mean, that's the thing that kind of almost haunts you a bit, right? I'm sure when you're wondering the why. When you can't get an answer to the why, when you feel you're providing a valuable service, you're being told it's a valuable service, and yet the actions of others are not reflecting that.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So we were just touching on housing, and when I ran for regional chair, when I was considering it and sort of just doing a bit of an exploratory, you were gracious enough to host a meeting with yourself and Lynn McCauley,
Yeah.
bless her, fantastic housing advocate, and I forget the gentleman's name that was also there. He was working on the Rocket Hotel project.
Oh, Steve Garrison of Cambridge
Yeah.
Housing. Our
Yeah,
house
so,
in Cambridge. Yeah.
yeah, so some great people there, but Lynn was just so dynamic.
Oh, yeah. I miss her dearly.
Oh, she was our affordable housing superhero. She's always saying, will you be my superhero? And I always said, Lynn, I'll be the Robin to your Batman, because I mean, you couldn't hold a candle there. I mean, she was. Mm-hmm. I could carry her cape, and I'd be fortunate. I mean, she was so blessed and so dynamic on this issue. Tell me about your work on the affordable housing piece.
Oh, goes back years for the Social Planning Council. Between, obviously on the trends report, we were coming up with the data talking about wait lists and the need of affordable housing. We did several community workshops. I mean, we were probably before our time that affordable housing really was what is now a crisis. But we could see the writing on the wall. And, for years we would talk about, oh yeah, there's 3,500 people on the regional wait list. 6,000 now?
Yeah.
It went by, it just shot up. So I think it's, the other thing too is that the information that the Social Planning Council had got out to the community. We had great relationships with the media. We got our stuff in the newspapers at the time, radio and Rogers or whatever, because a lot of times I don't think the residents of the communities really understand what their community looks like. And I think that was one of our major roles.
Well, you don't see it, right? They don't see it. That's the big problem. You're shining a light on an issue and bringing it to the forefront, because otherwise it's hidden.
Absolutely. And so I think that was another key role that, we did get good coverage and got the news out there to residents.
Speaking of not seeing it, like we always get a chuckle, you and I, on that Lot 42 story of yours. So why don't you just tell that too? And this was like what, in the past 5 years or so?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I think it was Smart City had put together a community event at Lot 42. Right. And in that big room there, and they had several speakers. And then after everyone spoke, we walked around the exterior of the room, and there were charts up and on different topics. And I remember getting to one that talked about homelessness and poverty in Waterloo region. And I was standing next to two young men, and I overheard them say, "Oh, we don't have that stuff here in Waterloo region. What's this all about?" And I said, "Excuse me, but I just overheard your conversation, and sorry to butt in, but do you not realize?" And I gave them some stats at the time, and they kind of looked at me, and I said, excuse me, but where do you live? And, "Oh, downtown Kitchener." I said, "So you've never saw a homeless person in your life?" "Oh, no, I don't see that." I said, "Okay, well, maybe you need to read up on this stuff." And I just walked away thinking, this is why there is a need to get that information out, because these were two young, intelligent guys who had no clue to the community they were living in.
Yeah, and that's, you've got to keep pounding the drum on that message.
Yeah,
because it just doesn't seem to me that, we're doing stuff, but it just doesn't seem to be in the earnest fashion that it needs to properly address this issue. We've got to pull out all the stops. I always say, as many as possible, as quickly as possible, by all means possible. It's just, and I don't think that mantra is being fulfilled. Too much regulation, too much bogged down in rules to make what we need happen. one of the projects you and I worked on, I remember when I was first on regional council, was a new thing for me, just being a regional councilor. It was nothing I expected when I ran for mayor, but was this whole concept of discretionary benefits.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
just tell us about how that all came about and what
Right.
that was.
So discretionary benefits were, some funding for various things that people would need to access. And we had the downloading from the province during the Harris years to the regional and municipal governments. And so, the regional government then had to pick up the tab for various things that people would need, particularly people on OW, ODSP. And we heard through various sources that they were looking at cutting discretionary benefits.
And just before we get into that, maybe just explain what discretionary benefits are and how they came about.
Well, as I said, they were provided provincially, the funding, but then the province then downloaded to the regions in the province. So now the region had to pick up the tab. So
right,
it could be anywhere.
Province, just so everyone knows, when they're downloading, that means they're cutting their expenses to make their budget look better, but they're pushing that problem down to the municipal level. So that cost is still there, but it's left to the local municipal politicians to ultimately decide whether it's going to continue or be discontinued.
Absolutely. So, things like dental, certain childcare issues, housing. I mean, it was a whole, even funerals,
Right. For who and for what group are we talking about?
It was mainly people who are on OW, Ontario Works, Ontario Disability Support, even the working poor. That could qualify. So, we heard rumors that this was going to happen. So the Social Planning Council, I called up some of my friends, including Lynn McCauley and others, and said, okay, I think we need to meet, because we were all hearing the same thing. So we had our meeting over at our office around the big table, and there were about 8 of us at the time. And we decided that we would refer to this group at that point as Poverty-Free Waterloo Region. That was and we got signs printed and we put them out like election signs and whatever. But so what we decided is that the Social Planning Council would introduce the delegations, and that each one of us would do a topic. One would be on housing, and that was obviously Lynn. And we had various people from childcare, the whole gamut of anything that was going to be cut or rumored to be cut around discretionary benefits. And so we decided that we would go to the November, December, and January regional council meetings and delegate, which we did. And not only did we go and delegate, but we also got the word out from people from other agencies to please attend, people that they knew, their clients, people with lived experience. We packed the house 3 nights. As I said, November, December, and January. Rob, you will remember this because you were sitting around the horseshoe. Yes. And it was standing room only. And so not only did we speak, the kind of the organizers, but we had everybody. I mean, we had loads of people delegating about various topics. And this went on for 3 months. And eventually in January of the year, when it's getting down to crunch time, we're back again, do the same thing. And I'll never forget when it got turned over to the council for discussion. You all agreed that Waterloo Region was better than this. Yeah, that you needed to find the money, and you did.
Yeah, and I think we might even went more than what staff might have been recommending, but we were always pushing to see what we could do. I mean, and that's like, and I appreciated that. I mean, my background, I had a pretty middle class living, I would say, but my parents came from Europe, from the poorest of the poor, so they were fortunate to get jobs in the 60s. Here they came in the 50s from war-torn Europe, basically still recovering and pretty impoverished, and everyone needs help from time to time, and things happen to people for a whole variety of reasons. We're not looking for fault. We're just looking for an opportunity to help people get a hand up, so that they can move on and
Absolutely. And I
reform.
think that was really a shining moment, not only for us as the Social Planning Council, bringing all those folks together, but also regional council.
Yeah, I think it was a good awakening there in terms of what you can do, right? You have to,
Absolutely.
and I find sometimes the politicians, like, you're elected and you don't really realize how much you can do. I was reminding my council in North Dumfries, so you're the lawmaking authority now. So, someone would come and say, hey, can we work on these roads overnight? And we'd say, yeah, okay. And we'd pass a bylaw. But I'd always say, but if I get complaints from the neighbors, we're going to pull it and change it because that's what we can do. So don't mess up.
Exactly.
You have the power to do a lot of things. And it is and there are a lot of competing interests. So to find funding for the discretionary benefits was a significant thing because sometimes you might be pulling from someplace else, but you need a strong base, a foundation, a solid foundation in your community, and that was one of the small ways that we could help out by doing that. I just wanted to ask you: we've been talking about the Cambridge Social Planning Council, Cambridge and North Dumfries. What about Kitchener? What did Kitchener or Waterloo? What was going on there? Did they have a similar organization?
Yeah, they also had a social planning council, and now it's called the Social Development Council. They didn't do the sort of research that we did. They were more involved with community engagement events, working with people with lived experience and hosting various things. Like they did all candidates meetings, that sort of stuff as well.
Right. So, okay, you're doing all this good work in the community, and we've just identified just a fraction of the things, through my involvement. You've got the trends report, you're facilitating, you're reaching out to groups, you're bringing information to council, which I would consider valuable information. You're advocating for people that really don't have an advocate, because who on council was elected by the homeless population to represent their views, right? I mean, it just... so you're shining a light on a lot of the problems that are happening in Waterloo region, the good, but it's not all the good.
Right.
So
exactly.
What happened to the organization?
I would say that probably starting back in 2017 and into 2018, I started to see the writing on the wall. And not that the work of the Social Planning Council wasn't wonderful and we were doing great things, but the money was getting tighter and tighter and tighter. And so I guess it was in the summer of 2018, I did some heavy looking at, what is out there available for us funding wise. And, things had also started to change a bit with what was available for funding. We always heavily relied on getting Trillium funding. They were changing things up. There was less money coming down from the province, federally and such. So I went to my board in that September and said, I really am not feeling very positive about our funding issues. And they agreed. But they said, well, you know what? Let's give it another year. Try your best and go for it. So I assembled my staff and I said, let's start looking, and which we had always been looking.
Yeah.
And we did that for a year. And then I started hearing things that the city was going to be changing things up in 2019 in regards to having to apply under a thing called grants for groups, which, we are a big organization. And then what are we going to be competing with right. Organizations that want $5,000?
Yeah, because you were getting, how much were you getting from the city?
About 100,000 of core funding. Yeah. And so I started hearing stuff like that. I had approached the region several times to increase our funding. They funded us probably 25,000, 30,000 each year for the community trends report. I was approaching them to say, can we have an increase of funding? We'd really like to do this regionally. What we're hearing from the cities of Kitchener and even our rural communities, that they would love to have something like that. And I wasn't getting good response. And then, so in 2019, I came back after time away, crunching all the numbers. And I went back to the board and I said, I'm really sorry. This is what I'm putting forward, that I can't believe I'm saying this, but I think my advice to you is that we need to wind things down. And I'll never forget the 5 or 6 people sitting around that table crying. And we're saying, no, we can't do that. We can't do that. And I said, okay. I said, here's what I found. This is what I found. And we just can't, we might be able to do it for 2019 going into, but it's not looking good.
Well, look, it gets exhausting. Look, first of all, I always say, you give a social agency, a group like yours, $1, they turn it into 5, okay? Because you find ways to expand it, and that's always a wonderful thing. Then, you run into these situations where some of the municipal politicians didn't understand what you were about, and some thought you had lots of money in the bank and didn't need funding.
Exactly.
I had personal experience with one of those. We won't name names, but we ran into that problem in terms of a complete misunderstanding about what your financial circumstances were. I think the United Way also, what happened with United Way?
Well, came 2019, 2019, they decided to cut our funding as well. That we didn't seem to fit in within their mandate, which to this day, again, is the big question mark. So back to the September board meeting, I announced this, and as I said, there were tears around the table. And I said, okay, so you have a choice. You can either decide to follow my advice or continue looking. I said, but I'll tell you right now, I can't do this anymore. I'm losing way too much sleep. It's affecting me in a very bad way.
And just so people understand, what was your organization comprised? What you've got a board, but in terms of the people, you had an office opposite City Hall, Cambridge City Hall.
Across the street. We weren't in City Hall.
Opposite.
Please remember. Yeah, we were across the street from City Hall.
Yeah.
We had a great office space, and we had a senior planner, a junior planner, I would say. And we also had information specialists, because we had received a grant for 5 years to create I Search My Community, which was a really valuable asset to the community that listed all the different agencies and whatever social agencies in the community that eventually went to 211. So then we also had every year we would have placement students from Laurier School of Social Work. We had Esparra Field from Toronto, Western, and those folks really helped us a lot, because we were providing them with the experience, and they did a lot of really good work for us and got some good training. And I have to say, a lot of them I then was able to hire once they finished school.
Yes.
And summer students and such. It just got to a point where I said, if we wanted to continue to be doing the things that we want to do, there's not money to do it.
So the board accepted the recommendation?
They accepted my recommendation, and which meant the process had to start. So the first thing is that we then had to go to the remaining staff to let them know. And it was quite interesting, because I had known these 2 women for years. And actually, the information specialist we had when she was at Conestoga College, and she never left us. And it was interesting, because I was so worried about them. And, they all said, yeah, we knew, it was.
You can see,
it wasn't any surprise.
The unspoken thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So we decided as a group that the staff would be told. We did hire a law firm that specialized in this kind of work, and kind of got the list of things that we had to do. And one of them for the board, and I have to say the board was fabulous, that one of their major concerns was our staff and how we would get, severance. And because in the nonprofit world, you don't have to give people severance unless you have a budget of what was it, $1 million, $2 million.
You wish.
Right. But you know what? During all those years, we did put a reserve together that we invested through the
Well,
community.
you have to, and that was one politician was upset about some reserve, and I'm like, well, what do you expect? I mean, you can't
That's
just live,
right.
paycheck to paycheck. You've got to have responsibly. You have to have a reserve in place if you want
Absolutely.
to keep the work going.
It's just something that unfortunately most nonprofits don't have, but we were
Yeah, don't have
fortunate
the
to be
luxury.
able to build this. And really, that's what helped us get through this in regards to being able to have, I'm not sure if it was called severance or whatever.
Well, whatever, but it was important to have that, especially during those times when funding wasn't available for something and you're sort of in between funding.
That's right. When we're talking about two people and plus myself who had served long term at the social plan.
Yeah, absolutely. Right? And there's no pension.
Right. Well, we did have a bit, but anyway,
Okay.
Yeah, we had matching RRSPs, but
good.
And that was kind of
so I understand
ahead of the game. But so then it was going through the Canada Revenue Agency revocation process.
Yeah.
And that happened in December of 2020. So it doesn't happen overnight because we decided, we made our formal announcement to the public in January of 2020, had a fabulous celebration of 30 years at the end of February, just in time to close for COVID. And we wrapped everything up. I finished August of 2020. And we have got the revocation in December, and then you have to go to the province as well. And that happened in February of 2021.
So Linda, we're going to kind of end on a sad note, I guess, the dissolution of the Social Planning Council. But while that is sad, for me, the happy part of it was the opportunity to meet you and work with you and to continue to connect with you from time to time going forward. I know I always enjoy once in a while picking up the phone to see how you're doing and what's going on. And I just want to say too, thank you to you and the Social Planning Council, because today, I get the opportunity to just go up to the road and play some pickleball or play some soccer at a facility, or play some hockey at a facility that has basically transformed our community. And that basically would have been extremely difficult. It may not even have happened, but for the work from the Social Planning Council. So all the best to you, Linda. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This has been a real pleasure. And you know what? You're not that gray either.
So this has been another edition of the Old Grey Mares podcast. I want to thank you for having listened and tagged along with us. Thanks again. All the best.